is not going to be sufficient, because even if you take a lot of their income, that may not withdraw sufficient demand to prevent inflation. So again, if the goal is to prevent inflationary pressures rather than finance the spending, it does matter which taxes you're going to raise. And simply taxing the rich, even if you tax all of their income, may just not be sufficient. So his preferred option would then be sort of a forced savings system where some of the income of the workers gets put into some kind of a savings account which pays interest, so they do not consume it today. And once the war is over, this savings gets released and workers can now consume and enjoy higher standards of living, and at the same time we prevent the problem of a post-war slump, because the government is withdrawing from the economy and demand is decreasing, right? We have workers adding the demand through consumption. All right. So that's the approach we also take, assuming that the Green New Deal actually is inflationary, which is not guaranteed, right? So that's the other thing. That it's a presumption, but nobody has really looked at it. So most of the costs of the Green New Deal are attributed to Medicare for All and the job guarantee. The economic part of the Green New Deal just happens to be the more costly one financially. But what people who do this financial costing forget is that, let's say, a job guarantee is not just going to use resources, it's also going to be a source of resources, right? So if the job guarantee workers are engaged in greening the economy, then yes, they will get wages which they will consume, so they will use resources, but at the same time, they are a resource for the Green New Deal as a whole, because they are workers who work in greening the economy, right? And the same logic applies to Medicare for All. Paul Krugman, for instance, wrote an op-ed where he said, well, Medicare for All is going to be so inflationary, so there's no way that it can get around raising the revenue. You have to raise taxes, you have to raise revenue, otherwise it's going to be inflationary, which already tells you that MMT has shifted the conversation to some extent, right? Because he is talking about inflation rather than the, paying for Medicare for All. But what he ignores is that Medicare for All is actually going to be deflationary, all else equal. So it's going to reduce demand because it's going to reduce how much we spend on healthcare. I won't be saying anything new here that the U.S. is an outlier in terms of our healthcare spending. We spend 18% almost of our GDP on healthcare. We do not get better results in other countries. So Canada spends about 10% of their GDP, and other European countries spend between 10 to 12, 13% of their GDP. So we are definitely an outlier when it comes to our healthcare spending. And a lot of that is attributed to prices. So, physician salaries, drug costs, hospital prices, and administrative costs, right? Because we have this weird way where there are all these different payers, so hospitals and providers have to hire people who would help them navigate the system, right? Make sure they get paid and so on. So there are different studies that show estimates of savings from 1.58% of GDP to all the way to 4.5% of GDP. So we can reduce our healthcare spending by that much, right? So that's resources that get released that are now available for the Green New Deal. That's our argument, that Medicare for All is not a cost, right? In financial terms, yes, it's a cost. It's shifting the cost away from the private sector and into the government. But in real terms, it's a source of resources, not a use of resources. Oops, wrong button there. All right. So we also look at various proposals for greening, right? We are not attached to these numbers. We just went off what's out there about what it would cost, how much resources would be required to green the economy, right? And we took different studies. Some of them had like a longer horizon. We shortened it. Some of them had like reduction of emissions by 40%. We increased that to 100%, right? As high of a number as we could get. And this is our estimate for how much we would need. So we took the top three average, and that's 5.6% of GDP. That's how much we would need per year for 10 years to green the U.S. economy and reduce our emissions to zero. And then we subtract what we already spent on fossil fuel investment, right? Because that's something we won't be spending anymore. So that, again, that's releasing resources that can now be used for greening the economy, all right? And this is our summary table. So you can see that, we bring in the economy, that is going to take 5% of GDP. So anything that's a positive number, that's going to be a use of resources. Anything that's negative, it's releasing resources. So it's a source of resources, right? So we want to, add them all together and see what's the final number, right? What are we really talking about? Is it 7% or 9% of GDP, like Paul Krugman says, just Medicare for all is going to require? And again, the job guarantee, right, it's on net, the cost is only 1% of GDP, and Medicare for all releases about 3.7% of GDP. Again, even with that, right, we would still be spending more than 14% of our GDP on healthcare, and that's higher than everyone else, all the developed countries. So if we did not increase taxes at all, the net resource cost comes up to 1.3% of GDP, right? So that's how much would be required to do a Green New Deal, or at least a version of it. And if that happens to be inflationary, which is, again, is not a given because the economy may be close to full employment, but it depends on how you measure it, right? We do think that there's a lot of slack in the economy. In fact, our estimates for potential GDP, right, those have changed over time, and we revise them all the time. Our estimates of the natural rate of unemployment, this unemployment rate, which once you were supposed to achieve, the inflation was going to go up, right, accelerate and so on. Well, that used to be 5%, and now our unemployment rate is below 4%, and so we still don't see that accelerating inflation we're supposed to see, right? So there's more room in the economy, and where we haven't reached our capacity, in other words, all right? But if that does, if it happens that we do need taxes, right? Again, with fidelity and tax rate and all of that is fine, but that may not be sufficient to reduce demand, right? So what we propose instead is similar to what Bernie Sanders proposes, some form of a payroll tax, which can then save about another 2% of resources. So once we add that, then the net resource cost is actually negative, right, not positive, so it's deflationary rather than inflationary. And again, we're not attached to these numbers in particular. What's more important is our approach, right, that this is a different way of costing the Green New Deal, approaching it from the MMT/Keynes perspective rather than this financial costing approach that the mainstream uses, all right? And I just want to point out that those taxes are not financing the Green New Deal. They are just opening up the real resource space for us being able to afford it in real terms, right? All right. So I'm going to stop right there. Just one thing that I want to show before that is that this is a graph of government spending during World War II in the U.S., and it also has, so the orange line there is government spending, and as a share of GDP, the gray line is the deficit with the sign reversed. So if it's positive, it's a deficit, again, in the period of World War II, and then there's the inflation rate. So clearly, during the war, we got inflation under control, right? So we did it, and we can do it again if necessary. So that should not be something that prohibits us from doing a Green New Deal. That's basically our argument, right? And Keynes has this great quote in the How to Pay for the War, and I'm just going to end with that, where he says we can snatch from the exigency of war positive social development, right? And our argument is that first, let's treat climate change as the moral equivalent of a war and mobilize resources to tackle it accordingly. And second, this is another example of how we can snatch the positive developments, right, through the job guarantee, through bringing the economy, higher minimum wage, which goes in the job guarantee, from this climate crisis that we are dealing with. All right, I'm going to stop right here, and I'll take questions.
I'll let Ron get a chance to scurry over. Hey, what's my talk all the time? I can put it So, as you'll be seeing shortly, my presentation is titled Monetary Policy for a Green New Deal. And I think of this as kind of focusing on a specific aspect of what Yemen just presented. So picking up where David just left off, on talking in a similar frame, and also following up on the frame that Fulwiler, Rowan, and I used in op-ed in the Financial Times, is MMT provides us a way of reframing the budgetary conversation. One way that we know, but I think there's a way we can make it a little more intuitive and kind of, get people to get more easily what we're saying. So let's start with the basic MMT. Taxes and borrowing don't pay for monetary sovereignty government spending. And what this MMT rhetoric is about financial constraints. It's about emphasizing the monetary power that a monetary sovereign has to be able to accomplish public goals in our society. But as Yemen was just saying, that there's other things that there's another way of talking about it, which is really where MMT drives at, which is budgeting aggregate demand. We're budgeting our aggregate demand, we're budgeting the output of our society. And in the aggregate demand sense, in the sense that taxes can drain purchasing power, they can open up room for additional government spending or spending from another sector. And in this aggregate demand sense, they partially pay for it, but as was emphasizing, not dollar for dollar. If you tax the rich $100 billion, you might drain only $15 billion or $40 billion of demand. And then this is very important. So we've already, even just at that point, totally reframed the way that fiscal policy in the United States is thought about. But there's a second key point here, is that MMT also reframed this discussion by emphasizing that they're non-fiscal pay-fors. The orthodox policy conversation is focusing on financial constraints and saying the only pay-fors are fiscal. You gotta cut spending, you gotta find taxes, you gotta find revenue from somewhere. This framing shows that all the different ways that don't involve fiscal policy directly at all, in which we can pay for, in this aggregate demand sense, Green New Deal or other policy priorities. This is just to give a quick taste of what I think is the research program in the Green New Deal context for these non-fiscal pay-fors. Run through them. One more obvious one is just to re-emphasize the point we always made. If you use this kind of framing of non-fiscal pay-fors, producing more is a pay-for. Everyone is jumping straight to talking about full employment and saying, MMT is irrelevant once you're in full employment. But it's important to emphasize we're not in full employment and haven't been in full employment most of the time. And also, full employment is hard to define. And producing more in this aggregate demand sense pays for government spending. Savings policies, I won't get into that more because we cover that in large part, but increasing the propensity to save, having sectors save more, can pay for government spending. And then environmental regulation, which is huge, and I think not going to be the focus of my presentation, but I think is the future of our conversations about MMT and the Green New Deal, is certain types of environmental regulations can shut down a plant, can stop that plant using energy, can shift workers to another sector that Green New Deal government spending can redeploy. We'll get to this more in a bit, but the whole question about are you going to have to raise taxes to pay for the Green New Deal? Well, paying for the Green New Deal with tighter environmental regulation sounds a lot more attractive. Politically and also just at an operational level, it makes a lot more sense for the goals we're trying to accomplish. But my focus is to touch a little bit on what the bottom is that antitrust and corporate law reform. I kind of did a little bit of this for Lua, but that is a tool that can also be aimed at disemployed resources that can be redeployed and restructure our economy to produce in ways that is more useful for us, in ways, for example, Mag Dickinson was talking about. But what I'm focusing on is financial regulation. So we can regulate and restrict credit, and that can be paid for by draining demand in the economy. especially an economy that has large amounts of private debt like our economy has. And so this is what is and it's not just the credit that they allocate, but the financial sector uses up a lot of resources. You go to almost any city, how much of the physical space of cities now are taken up by financial institutions? It's a running joke that like almost everywhere you go, there's nothing actually useful in services. I live in Manhattan, so especially in Manhattan, but there's plenty of bank branches with 24-hour ATMs burning up energy. We think of this as just like immaterial, there's just numbers floating everywhere, but there's a huge energy infrastructure devoted to this, and maybe that's not the best use of our resources in a Green New Deal world. So it's also the resources that they directly consume, the office space, the air conditioning that we devote to proprietary trading and designing more and more complex derivatives, and maybe that is not the most pressing thing that we have going on in our society in 2019. And the other great thing about financial regulation is it can also serve the purpose of especially targeting the quote-unquote brown sectors, the sectors that are the most environmental deleterious, and in this way it overlaps with our environmental regulation perspective. And what I was talking about earlier in terms of environmental regulation being a non-physical pay for. And as I was talking about, that the financial sector is enormously politically unpopular. There's an energy that you can get with Shrink Wall Street to grow the green economy that that taps into something very intuitive for a lot of people, and it's why narratives that we find problematic, like financial transaction taxes as like Robin Hood tax to pay for all the good things we want, are politically popular and they get attention, is because they're grasping towards this idea of shrinking finance to grow the green economy. And of course, shrinking finance also deals with financial instability concerns, which of course are at the center of FMT in so many ways. I want to touch on this point, which is this is sort of in the mainstream economics conversation. If you follow the conversation about monetary policy, they talk about the Fed offsetting what Trump is doing all the time. Now, there's arguments about the extent to which the Fed has actually done that, but that's part of the conversation. It's just not never connected up to our larger priorities, and it's especially never, and it's simply just the reason that the CBO doesn't forecast inflation or really just repeats the Federal Reserve's forecast of inflation is they're just assuming the Federal Reserve can deal with it. So we don't have a planning process that even deals with our resource use or thinking about inflation in a serious way in our economy. And if we think the budgeting constraint is a real resource constraint, is an inflation constraint that is mind-bogglingly backwards. And the last thing I would say, to get to a little bit more, talking about zero interest rate, permanent zero interest rate policy, is that this is obscure because, the Fed's going to raise interest rates, that means that's going to blow out the deficit, because interest rates are inevitably going to rise, and we're going to be paying 100,000 trillion interest payments over 40 years, and come on, that's not sustainable, we can't do anything. But the kernel in here is that monetary policy, including an expansive idea of monetary policy that includes financial regulation, can be paid for. And we just need to get past this unproductive CBO projection of interest payments in the future to see that. And kind of touch on this quickly because we're a little bit behind, but then there's the question of what actually financial regulation that we're going to use. Capital, we talk a lot, I could do a whole presentation on this slide, but capital requirements and liquidity requirements are truly direct. They don't really necessarily directly affect what banks can do, what financial institutions can do. Financial institutions can innovate around them. It's not necessarily the most effective way to reduce demand generated by the financial sector in a planned way that can facilitate a Green Deal. So what options does that mean that there are? Direct qualitative and quantitative regulation. We regulate the quality of the borrower, the quality of the sector, with the quality of the lending, and also we regulate the quantity. We put direct controls on how much credit that banks can create, how much credit banks can create, and this puts a limit on the resources these entities can engage in. And while we need more and more writing about it, if you look back, this has been an essential part of also MMT's discussions about financial stability for many years. There's references to direct credit controls all throughout. Regs, Fulwiler's, Mitchell's, a whole suite of conversations about financial regulation, and we can bring that back into the pay-for conversation. And that also these tools have existed. They were very prominent in the mid-century all around the world. Bretton Woods, capital controls and credit controls often went together, or credit regulation and the regulation of financial transaction across borders went together. Particularly successful in the mid-20th century France. There's a great book by an economic historian, Eric Monet, who was at the Bank of France, that's recently out, that gets into this history a lot, but it's also all throughout the history of developing countries. And so this isn't something that is, out there, or crazy or anything like that, and has often recognized, and even starting to be recognized in the mainstream economic policy conversation. It's a big part of how China runs macroeconomic policy, and it is, and this is also something that Professor Ray has written about. This gets us to permanent zero interest rate policy, a long-standing MMT policy. How does that fit into the Green New Deal? I think the biggest thing is the political economy, that when you take interest rate policy off the table, you eliminate the ability to project a graph where interest rates are going to explode to infinity. And it's easy to say monetary policy isn't loose because interest rates are low, because we're pursuing this very restrictive financial regulation policy. And it gives us a narrative for saying why bubbles aren't just going to explode everywhere in the policies we're recommending, and it takes a huge political economy attack on us off the table, or at least gives us something that's intuitive and makes sense to a lot of people, and also is just a policy that MMT believes in, that MMT has believed in historically. And that, contra, some critics have started circulating around about this being America First policy. The global financial cycle with dollar-denominated debt around the world is tied to America's interest rate policy. When America raises interest rates, its exchange rate goes up, and the burden of dollar-denominated debt is around the world is doubly burdened, because both the interest is going up and the value of that dollar debt in their own currencies is exploding. And then this, to kind of bring that back in, again, in qualitative credit regulation really means we can really target the fossil fuel industry. And the other thing I would say that's distinct about this kind of policy from World War II, where there also were direct credit controls, is we haven't had the kind of situation where that the Great Depression had with mass defaults throughout the economy, so there wasn't actually that much private debt. We still have a gigantic amount of private debt in this country, and so paying down your debts could become a pay for rather than kind of having to pay a bunch more taxes. I'm just going to put this on the table. This is kind of a little bit more something that I think needs to be discussed more, but in the context of the last decade or 15 years, where non-financial corporations largely have not been investing in many sectors, but as we know from MMT, a large government deficit has filled up their retained earnings. There's the corporate saving. Restricting credit might not be directly enough to influence the situation, so we might need kind of direct liquidity or monetary regulations on non-financial corporations, and this kind of overlaps with this conversation about forced safety and being part of, essentially part of this project. And also connects up with other goals that we might have about how we want to structure in the American economy to serve the project of decarbonization and democracy. This gets into this is a way to start thinking about what a different budgetary process would look like. One that's a little more dynamic and not just this like Congress drops some bills and then CBO rejects everything and then the Fed is supposed to manage the economy. Is you can have that not necessarily telling administrative agencies exactly what to do, but having certain very strict guidelines on how and how much of demand does Congress want regulatory agencies to be moving through direct credit regulation, and that especially this can be sectorally and geographically targeted in ways that facilitate a just transition. But this also means beefing up the economic policy expertise of Congress and of administrative agencies. It's kind of a big conversation right now that most of the lawyers that are involved in these processes don't know anything about macroeconomic policy. So to connect to Maggie Dickinson's presentation, there's recent events at Brookings with Yair Lissapin on law and macroeconomics, where they talk about talking to lawyers in these agencies and asking them basic questions about macroeconomics, and their face just goes blank. It literally never occurs to any lawyer that a work requirement when someone, when there's mass unemployment in an economy, isn't going to actually help them, get them to find work because there's no work to be found. It's not a thought that occurs to them. And of course, Brookings is taking that in the very center-left way to say maybe we should suspend work requirements for food in recessions, when the NPR declares recessions, but then food requirements are great and every other piece of the time. Touch on this a little bit. This also brings up the conversation about central bank liquidity swaps, which is a great unresolved issue about the 2008 financial crisis, the trillions of dollars of lending based on just basically whatever the Federal Reserve thought was a good idea at the time to central banks around the world. And this is again, something that we should be considering using as a tool to facilitate and encourage other countries to pursue a green deal, to implement a job guarantee, and implement certain basic democratic reforms if those don't exist in those countries. So I'll just end on my takeaways. Sorry if I took a little too much time. Orthodox economic policy only has fiscal pay-fors, and that makes it a very limited framework, and those fiscal pay-fors are all about financial. So it's dollar for dollar. It's not analyzing the actual aggregate demands of these effects of these fiscal policies. MMT opens the way to many more politically popular policies, and using the MMT framework, we can think about how we can construct a coalition for a Green Deal and push the kind of policies that we're interested in decarbonization to happen in this country globally. This is a key reason that motivates this presentation, is that MMT still matters at full employment. This total myth that is the kind of most sophisticated criticism of MMT has no basis whatsoever. It's why we wrote the FT op-ed, but it needs to be hammered in constantly that this is a whole different budgetary world, even if every last resource and every last person is fully employed. We just have a totally different approach to budgeting, and I think this presentation makes that very clear, as well as the ongoing work that the MMT community is producing on this. And just going to touch on this a little bit, kind of makes more sense in the context of the conversation with Lua, that non-fiscal pay-fors are more effectively democratize and rebalance the economy than taxes. These non-fiscal policies, it's not just like we're letting the corporate economy on the hook, we're restructuring it in fundamental ways. Taxes aren't necessarily the way that you need to discipline corporations and discipline the private sector. There's other things we can do, and we can break out of the autonomous mindset that as long as we put a price on something, then that stops behavior that we think is bad or undesirable. That's it.
Well, thank you, Nate. Do we have still time for questions?
Yes, sir.
I think
we'll go until about 4.
About 4, so half an hour left for questions. So I'm sure that you have questions. Yeah, maybe let's start here.
This is a question for Maggie. In the estimates of the amount of revenue, the amount of costs of the food programs that you have, did that include in-kind programs like Section 32 and things like that? It did.
It's all means tested programs excluding medical care because that one is also very big. And so I would assume, and that's not my work, as I said, I'm not an economist. But so if it's means testing housing programs would be included.
Okay.
So that's a program where you have to meet a certain income requirement to qualify.
Thanks. I think I should talk to you because I work on these things.
Tying to Bell's discussion of the monetary sector, analysts proposal for a free new deal. I live in a country without sovereignty, and as the government, my country has very little fiscal space to afford or propose very ambitious or bold projects such as the Green Deal or job guarantee. Let's do a country like that too. Forget about developing a Green Deal, propose a limited Green Deal, or struggle to gain or regain monetary sovereignty. What would be your proposals? Including there could also expand that as well.
Sure. So tomorrow we have a whole hour on this, but the short answer is, my argument at least, is to use the job guarantee program as an employment-led transition to monetary sovereignty. So it's not you either have monetary sovereignty or you don't. There's all in emphasizing the real resource mobilization is an extremely important part. And there's no cookie-cutter approach to it for every country, for every developing country. But tomorrow we'll outline some of the specifics. So the short answer, it's possible, it's not easy, there are obstacles, but the lens allows us to focus on what are the obstacles and tackle them directly.
Well, maybe I can just add that when it comes to Eurozone countries, what we could do, of course, is we could have the Green New Deal being financed by the European Investment Bank, which is our kind of research and development bank that's publicly owned, already issues green bonds. So we could ramp them up from a couple of billions a year to hundreds of billions a year. And then we could give the money to the Eurozone governments.
Sure. I personally am opposed to a central bank managing on this policy and democracy. I mean, that would basically be all democracy.
Well, I mean, the money would be spent by governments, not by central bank. Okay, any more questions?
Here. Here.
Thank you. This question would probably be directed to the assistant. In the MMT macroeconomics course that Adam Rice and I are teaching in New York, on Monday night, that's macroeconomic policy night, and we start with Keynes and how to pay for the war and end with your article, How to Pay for the Green New Deal. In the course of this, we had occasion to wonder, well, to what extent did the policies of the United States and the United Kingdom actually follow Keynes' advice in how to pay for the war? I had a little bit of discussion with one person about what happened in the United States. It seemed the United States went more for voluntary savings rather than forced savings. But we couldn't find any information as to what did Great Britain actually do during the war. To what extent did they follow Keynes' recommendations? And if they didn't, do you know why they didn't?
That's That's a very good question to which I don't know the answer, actually. And I was going to say, in case of the U.S., we didn't do that, right? And I guess an exception would be either the UK, but that's something to look into. I don't really know the answer to that.
So obviously we need to look into it more, but my understanding is that there was a policy consensus by a lot of people who were discussing these ideas that was cross-Atlantic, that a forced saving policy was very administratively difficult to do, and when you're uncertain about when the war is going to end, the longer the war might go on, the more of a deferred saving policy kind of looks or functions just like a tax. So why don't you just do a tax anyway? I'm not saying that that's necessarily true or correct, but that's the way that they thought about it at the time. And you can read in a lot of the documents talking about like using taxes to curb inflation. There's a 1943 book from the Tax Institute that talks all about this, and there's kind of just this consensus that it doesn't work. But obviously, in our new world, we have all sorts of programs to do this, from health insurance to pension funds. So I think we're in a different context than they were.
Yeah, just a quick note. What Keynes is saying in the book is that the preferred option is considered a voluntary savings option, right? That you just encourage people to save more, give them higher interest rates, other incentives to save, and that's the way to go. And that's what he's saying, well, no, that's not the way to go. So I think the consensus is that that's the right approach, and so Keynes is arguing that that's not the right approach. So.
I wanted to ask Professors Nassassian and Kaboub if they would accept 4 related revisions to the job guarantee program that I think are necessary if it's going to solve the problem of food security. First of all, one should not be asking for a living wage of $15 an hour, but a fair minimum wage tied to productivity gains. Since according to the government's own statistics, in no city in America,
can anyone afford to rent an average apartment if they don't make $22.50 an hour? And in addition, if you just have a minimum wage that is not tied to productivity gains, you do nothing to prevent the advance of income and wealth
inequality. It turns out if we do adjust the minimum wage at its maximum value in 1968, it comes to $22.50, which is exactly. Secondly, even a fair minimum wage is not going to help people who can't work because they're disabled or because they're retired. So you need to attach to this proposal an equivalent income replacement for the disabled and retirees. Thirdly, doing all of that is not going to help people who have children. So you need to have a child allowance, according to government figures, of $900 per month per child, so that families can afford to feed their children. And fourthly, you should not attach benefits to work or work history. They should be completely detached, but made universal.
Well, I think something I would say is that the numbers you mentioned, right, they probably don't take into account all the things that go into a Green New Deal package, right? And it's not just the job guarantee, it's also Medicare for all. So things that households are paying for now, they won't be paying for, right? Some Green New Deal programs, and I did attach to education, they have free college education, right? Or affordable college education, for example. There's universal child care, which takes up a lot of the budget from people with kids. Somebody who has kids knows, right? So once you take all of that into account, I think a $15 minimum wage becomes something else, right? It's not what we would be currently. So that's one thing I would say. But what we went off of in our paper was the leading proposal for the job guarantee, so the numbers were just based on that. And if we were to raise the wage, then the numbers would have to be adjusted accordingly. And so the resource use that I showed you that comes from the job guarantee portion would have to be adjusted accordingly as well. That's
so my presentation was relatively short here, so I didn't go through all the details, which I go through in other places. But in short, the overall philosophical framework that addresses this question is that we should guarantee employment at decent wages, living wages, and most of my work I use the MIT Living Wage Calculator database, which is aims at $22+ an hour living wage, and it takes into account family size and so on. So number one, a job guarantee for people who want to work, ready, willing, and able to work. Number two, because of the fiscal policy space that we have, fully funding programs at the local level, at the state level, to provide basic public services, which includes healthcare and education and all the things that have been defunded over the last 30, 40 years. And number three, for people who can't work and shouldn't work for health reasons and so on, providing a decent income support system that allows people to live a dignified life. So this is definitely part of our philosophy, and I've said it many, many times publicly in all my work. Our discussion here doesn't really matter for, in terms of estimating whether you estimate 15 or 60. The point is that financially we can afford it. But I agree with you, we should be very clear about, what our moral responsibility is in terms of fulfilling, as a guarantee, decent quality of life for everyone at living wages and paying basic public services.
Yeah, I would agree. Actually, I just want to add one thing. I think I had a student the other day who we were talking about the Fight for 15, and she said, yeah, it doesn't really matter because in a couple of years, it's not going to be worth anything, right? And I think politically, when we talk about this politically, I think you're absolutely right when we talk about guaranteeing a decent wage that has to be pegged, right? Whether it's to inflation or to productivity growth, it has to be pegged to something because people have an intuitive understanding of this, right? It's a community college student, she got it like that. So I think you're right. Nothing that you said I disagree with, except to say the other thing that you really have to think about is in talking about a jobs guarantee. And I understand when we talk about the Green New Deal, there tends to be a lot of thinking about sectors that are particularly polluting, right, or contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So buildings, transportation, right, and transforming those sectors. But I also think it's really, really important that we also think of care work at the center of that economy and at the center of any jobs program. Because exactly like what you're saying, just having a job doesn't alleviate all the burdens that are associated with the expectations of work, particularly women, particularly people who are caring for both elderly people or children. So I think part of my thinking around transforming something like what exists right now, right, the infrastructure and shareable food, is to make those systems public communal meal programs, right? So that you're doing two things at once. You're employing people, but you're also reducing that care burden on people. And I think that has to be central to our thinking about any jobs program.
I think the leading proposal basically has that, right? Some of the jobs will be care work, and we're saying that, okay, if we just assume half is care work and the other half is devoted to pretty deep economy, then this is the estimates become
So my question is about physics and technology for the future. If we're going to make this transition, I see that very much happen. But when we finally get there, are we going to realize that fossil fuels give us so many things? We have 100 fossil fuel slaves doing all the stuff, creating the plastic cups, the plastics on this chair, the roads, the diesel trucks that deliver everything to us, is our world going to look entirely different? You know, the GOP says all kinds of things like, you're taking away my hamburgers, my airplanes, all that stuff. They have kind of a point, because before fertilizer and fossil fuels, there was only 1.5 billion people on the planet, and actually manures were the things that raised our food. My question is the technology really that good? Can we support 7.5 billion people once we finally get there?
So we have some of the technology, but part of the Green New Deal would be massive investment in research and development to produce the kind of technologies that we don't have to completely green the economy, decarbonize the economy. Let's be honest, the solar panels that we're all big fans of, what's going to happen to them after 30 or 40 years when they become obsolete? I mean, it's toxic stuff, right? So what we're talking about is massive research and development to get to a point where everything we produce, everything we consume and transport is fully embedded into a circular economy, fully goes back into good use, which means when I buy something, it comes with a user manual to figure out how to use the thing, and it comes with a living will that says, this is how we're going to recirculate every single component of this, and we have to build the infrastructure for that, and we have to be fully ready to live in a circular economy. So the short answer, we're not there yet. We have quite a bit of space to start on a massive scale with the technology that we have. But there's plenty that needs to be done to fully get there. In terms of food, I would argue that we do have the capacity to do that, but not with the current food system, the way we produce and the way we consume. There is a sustainable agricultural system that doesn't require fertilizer, that doesn't require massive large-scale shipping where a piece of salad drives in a truck for 3,000 miles for us to have lunch here. That's the system we have, and that's the power structure that we have today. So if we want to change it, we have to tackle the fossil fuel industry and their market power and their political power. We have to tackle the food system industry. This is where the legal and regulatory structure is extremely important in a democratic process to pinch those pressure points in the economy and say, we don't want this anymore, this is not sustainable, we want to create a different world. So we have the capacity to do it. The question is to empower people to organize and to fight against those power structures and demand a more sustainable system.
The other thing I would throw in there is that we're certain what's going to happen if we don't try. That's an absolute certainty. We know that millions of people are going to die. We know that human life on this planet is going to become extremely adverse. So we're certain what happens if we don't try. And so we have to take our best shot at trying. And maybe we'll be surprised about what mobilizing millions upon millions of human labor hours actually directed to our social goals and our overriding social goal, which is to sustain our own existence, versus all the other things that that our social labor is slaughtered on. So let's check back after we try it. Let's see if we get there. But we have to take our best shot. We have to take our best shot 10 years ago, but at the very least, we have to take our best shot at the earliest possible opportunity we can possibly push through that kind of program. And then it's a mad dash to try to catch up.
I just wanted to say one thing about food from that perspective. So I think we have been convinced that we actually need this large-scale food system that has developed. I think we're often told, especially by those large food producers, that they are feeding the world, and without them, there wouldn't be enough food for everyone. That's not true. That's not accurate. And in fact, a lot, you mentioned fertilizers, and can we grow enough food without these inputs from a number of people? the fertilizer industry, large-scale use of fertilizer happens after World War II, and there was a lot of chemical producers who were trying to figure out what to do with these chemicals that they had produced. And they were like, well, we put it on farms, we use this fertilizer, and really up until that point, you didn't have intensive fertilizer use and the kind of industrial agriculture that we have. That is, in many ways, also degrading ecosystem. So we're not even trying to look that far in the past, and I think that's part of it. I think people do worry. I think those concerns are valid, but I also think we really have to think about the stories that we're telling and we're being told, right? Particularly around, is there enough food, can we survive? Like, yeah, we already produce enough food. We produce so much food in the United States that we're literally just like throwing it away over our shoulders, right? This is not something we need to actually be worried about in that sector. But I think we're right that concern is there.
I'm just going to take a little probably to make one comment on that, which is without any feeling of the question motive behind that particular question. I think, and I think a few of my friends agree with me on this, that one of the issues about that kind of question is that in contemporary contexts around the world, where there isn't a shared baseline of solidarity and care for every person, what the question often ends up meaning is not, is it impossible to save everybody, but rather, shouldn't it be okay to rationalize giving up and trying to save everybody? And if you think about the World War II analogy, what we're really saying is, if it's impossible to save everybody, isn't it okay if certain kinds of people die? And I think what we need to make sure is that we don't let ourselves take that kind of question seriously when that is the underlying implication behind things.
So there's one thing that I've been wondering for quite a while now as I've been learning about MMP and the job guarantee agreement deal. So obviously the job guarantee is elastic to the labor supply. It ensures full employment of the labor supply at all times. And it seems like it would be excellent for studying jobs like many fields in various parts of care work and public service. But a lot of the more project-oriented jobs that are going to be key to averting absolute climate catastrophe during the most critical portions of the Green Deal seem like they might have demand for labor that would exceed the supply. So would it be necessary to have some additional framework for staffing those jobs outside of the job guarantee? Something like hiring that would compete potentially with job guarantee work and other public work and even private sector work?
So in our paper we mentioned that a lot of the infrastructure projects are probably not going to be done by job guarantee workers, infrastructure projects necessary for the Green New Deal. Some smaller projects that don't necessarily require a particular skill or a skill that's difficult to acquire, whatever, right? Those can be done, but otherwise, so major infrastructure projects that would have to be done with workers that may already be employed. You're right? So when we say there is still slack in the economy, there may be slack in some sectors, but there are sectors that may already be close to full employment. So we definitely acknowledge that, right? What we're saying is that we can plan and we can phase in projects, right, to make sure that we avoid inflating sectors that are already inflated. So yes, definitely taking that into account, and then we need to have a plan. We can't just say we're going to start full speed, everything has to be done right now, right? So that requires planning. And then what would people be saying when there's a recession, right? Which is going to happen at some point, right? And at that point, there will be all this pool of available labor that is no longer, fully employed. So that's just something to be
Of course, it does seem like inflation would be a significant concern for that.
So once we're clear about that this is not an issue of financial constraint, but a real resource constraint, then introducing a Green New Deal, not all the Green New Deal work would be a job guarantee paid at $15 an hour, whatever we decide is the base wage. Once we realize that the federal government has the capacity to fully fund defunded public infrastructure programs and education and health programs, then we hire people with the right skills and experience at full pay with benefits and mainline public employment. Once we recognize this is what society wants as a basic priority. So the job guarantee is really the transition piece that guarantees nobody's left behind. Once we realize these are mainline public services, they should not be temporary, they should not be transitional, this becomes mainline public employment.
Since we are running out of time, I will collect now 2 questions from these tables, and then I'll walk over there and get 2 more questions.
Hi, Sam Letty. Go back to the gentleman over here's question about saving. I'm very interested in saving policies. I'm talking about it tomorrow at the Finance Forum. But so this question is kind of directed for Professor Nersessian, but I'd be curious to hear what the whole panel thinks about this issue of voluntary versus forced saving. So to provide just a tiny amount of background, during World War II, there was a big debate about this. Keynes, in How to Pay for the War, kind of comes in on the side of forced saving, and I think he actually writes, like, people who believe that voluntary saving will work are victims of their own propaganda. The basic argument is that it just won't be enough, or it's just not going to work. On the other side, you have Beardsley Rummel, who is a kind of hero of the MMT world, who is making the argument that voluntary savings policies could have tremendous benefits in terms of, like, creating support for the emergency, people making active patriotic choice to contribute, and also, educating people about how the system works, how the monetary system works, or MMT in this case, what those issues are. During the actual war, the U.S. kind of skirted the issue where they could say we had a voluntary savings policy, but it was sort of only half voluntary because we had price controls and rationing and stuff that were, and I think we did actually expand Social Security in kind of the same way you were proposing, that did that. So, yeah, my question is basically, do you have a take on forced versus voluntary savings?
I think this is probably most people. I'm curious if it's a nationalistic view of the Green New Deal, where this is not exactly correct, but basically America owns the solutions, and I don't know how it works as far as a profit from it, obviously not the government, but rich people profit from it. Can you define that a little bit? And also, it seems to me that it's not just a bad idea, it is basically, I can't see it as anything else as the rich people in our country will enjoy the caviar as the ship goes down. So.
Okay, 2 more questions maybe from the other side through.
Hi. So I'm Steve with Real Progressives, and first of all, I want to thank you all for doing this. To me, this is the panel that I care the most about at this event. I'm very, very concerned that we get into these lofty discussions about, really, really highbrow things, and the reality is it takes tremendous amounts of momentum. It takes tremendous amounts of penetration for people that are easily distracted by impeachment, easily distracted by other political shiny objects. How can we take this incredibly important information that each of you have presented today, and this isn't just about a framing issue, how do we build the urgency for people that are living hand to mouth, for people that are constantly worried whether their home is going to be foreclosed on, for people who are working longer, have less time with their families, etc. I feel like as much as I enjoy MMT, and I love it and live for it, I don't understand how we're going to cross that threshold. And I think that right there is the key to us surviving. If we really believe this is a climate thing, if this is a real thing, Why are we talking about anything else? Why is impeachment even on the table? I don't really care one way or the other. My point is, if this is as near and dire as it is, why is our hair not on fire?
Okay, because we're running out of time, we can cut it short here. But if you have more questions, of course, you can ask the panelists afterwards. Thank you.
So, in the interest of time, I guess I can just comment on the voluntary versus forced savings. I think Haynes' point is that the voluntary savings is just not, is not guaranteed to work, and it creates the dynamics that I was talking about, where if one person does it, right, it's not going to work. Everybody needs to buy into it, or a lot of people need to buy into it for it to work, right? Because it needs, you need collective action there. And if you don't, then you have the issue of inflation. And we do mention price control, strike rationing in our paper, and we say to the extent that that's going to be necessary for particular things, then that's something we should do as well. And keeping in mind that the goal is keeping that on real resources, and what is it that we need, and what is it that we don't have enough of, what is it that we're trying to ration, right? So yes, it is a planning process, and that needs to happen, right?
I'll just take Jeff's question real quick to get context. That's based on the Business Insider op-ed, co-authored recently with Andres and Raul. And so basically, a little bit off the beat path, but obviously Green New Deal, that we're concerned about an alternative Green New Deal vision that doesn't just completely abandon direct federal public spending, but decenters it to reduce the online budgetary costs by looking towards lending and equity stakes. Elizabeth Warren talks about how there's a potential $23 trillion new market in renewable energy over the next few decades, and she says that, quote, America should dominate that market. What she means is equity stakes that the United States government buys into companies to provide, quote-unquote, pension funding, so that these companies can then go out and charge the rest of the world exorbitant amounts to get access to what is essentially life-saving technologies in the historical world, or the next big export move for the United States. It's part of the New Deal, part of having an internationalist vision is something especially Ronald championed in MT for many years is copy left and patent left the fruits of the New Deal and job guarantee, so that there's other countries have access to these technologies at no monetary cost. That's an essential part of having an international vision, actually accomplishing our goal of decarbonization, which is obviously a global goal.
I'll just say one thing about wealthy and inequality. So think of our current economy as an engine that produces inequality, that produces pollution, that produces socioeconomic exclusion. So if you introduce a Green New Deal without changing that engine, and we say the government is going to feed that engine more money, it's going to produce the same effect, and money will be sucked out to the top. That's why it's extremely important to look at the existing power structures and use all the resources that we have on the table here, in the MMT table, to change the power structure, the existing power structure, so that it produces equitable results, so that it doesn't suck wealth to the top, so that it doesn't exclude people. That's really the core of what we need to be addressing here. And Steve, I like your shiny political object. That's really the distraction, right? I'm not saying we should impeach the president. I'm not saying all the other issues are not important. They're important, but who's really, really happy about this? That we're not talking about inequality, we're not talking about healthcare, we're not talking about the Green New Deal 24/7 in the last several days. And if the issue of impeachment goes away, then other shiny object will appear. This is really where, and that's why so many people are not interested in the political process. It doesn't matter if it's Pence or Bush or Clinton or it's all the same for a lot of people in this country who don't really care, because their basic, quality of life and livelihood is not being discussed. There's no alternative that they see on the table. And that's the power of the media, that's the power of the power structures that produce the options for us on the table. And we need to change that. And MMT provides us the lens that gives us clarity and tells us these are the things that matter. And a better world is not just possible, it's within reach. It's right there. We're just blinded by these shiny objects.
Yeah, you want to comment one last comment before I close?
One last point to you, which is that I think organizing is really important in all sectors, and I want to quote two very disparate people. So Lenin one time said, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are months when decades happen. Right? In politics can happen very, very fast. The other person I want to quote is Milton Friedman. I know. Who said that, I'm not going to get this quote right, but basically, what happens in a crisis is that ideas get picked up that have just been lying around. And I think one of the things that some of the work that's happening here is that people are creating the ideas that are lying around for when the politics start to happen really fast. Right? And I think we're very close to one of those moments. So.
Yeah, to end this on an optimistic note regarding Steve's question about what the future will bring. I mean, in Germany we have now the Left Party, which says they have the Red-Green New Deal. Okay? And the European Commission, which is a new one, says we want a Green Deal. And they say it has to be publicly financed. Okay, so the public sector will pay for it. So that's the European Commission saying that. And they could do it. Okay, so of course then you could say, why do I care about Europe? Well, we could say, hey Trump, you're number 2. You want to be number 1? Do something. Okay, so that's also politics. There will be a race to become the most greenest nation on the planet. And we have to ignite that fire and make it happen. It's an international thing, so if things are not looking good in your country, then never mind, there will be other countries who will increase the pace, increase the speed, and then the others will have to play catch up. That will happen. And then, of course, it's like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nobody expected it, but it happened anyway. It had to happen. Okay, same as climate change. It's happening, and we have to stop it, so it will happen at some point. So thank you very much for my panel too.
And pretty good. We're going to have a very short break, 10 minutes. Get up, stretch your legs, get some air, go to the bathroom. We want to have this last panel out so that we can all go to the bar tonight. We've got drink tickets, and it's been a long day, but hopefully it won't hold. And I mean 10 minutes. We'll be trying